Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you remember where we left off. We were talking about the early parliamentary system established in the first 19 years after Nigerian independence. Now, initially what happened was in the 1959 parliamentary elections that were going to be used to establish the new state of Nigeria, the Hausa party, the NPC, won half of the seats in the House. This allowed them to essentially dominate the legislative body, and they also formed a coalition with the NCNC, which was a primarily Igbo group. Remember, this meant that the Yoruba party, the one that was most strongly associated with them, the Action Group Party, fragmented. There were internal disputes and upset people who were upset with the leadership structure, and ultimately this led to fighting throughout the Western region. And by gosh, I'm trying to pull the year out of my head without reference. I'd have to Google it real quick for you. But very, very quickly, the regional legislature, where the AGP had most of its seats, had fragmented and fallen apart. This meant that the central government of the newly formed First Republic of Nigeria had to establish emergency rule. Part of the reason why they did this was because the capital city of Lagos, the federal district of Lagos, was surrounded on all sides by the western region, and the concern was that if the unrest spread into Lagos, it could totally handicap the entirety of the government. It could prevent the government from functioning. So, as a result, what happened was there was a push very quickly after the independence of Nigeria for the creation of more states. The thought was that just by having these three broad regions, you had far too much potential for the Senate to be controlled by one or two parties. And so what you had was the fragmenting of those three large regions into smaller states. Now, this resulted in increased decentralization of power. Now, the NPC didn't like this because they had actually benefited from the way the system already was established in 1960. So they objected. And they were afraid that if there were more states, their party influence might actually be lessened. What you saw with this push towards the increase of states in Nigeria was the growth of ethnic conflict. The thought was that the more states there were, the more individualized they would be around ethnic conflict. Enclaves. And this was both something that some groups really wanted, particularly if they were a small ethnic group. They wanted to have a greater voice, and so that fragmenting of state power was something that would potentially benefit them. If it was a larger group, like the Hausa Fulani groups, then the fragmenting was potentially problematic because it would give greater voice to smaller groups. So ultimately what occurs is in 1965, there are parliamentary elections that are held. And these elections are violent and they're unstable, particularly in the Western region. More than 2,000 people died in the ensuing chaos. And as a result, army officers, which were mostly Igbo, staged a coup d'etat. They went into Lagos. They actually assassinated the prime minister, and they assassinated several party leaders and other military officials, many of whom were Hausa and from the north. The army officers who seized control suspended the existing constitution. They banned all political parties, and they called for a unitary government, which they themselves would essentially rule. This resulted in a civil war. Northern troops, particularly those who were deeply, deeply distressed by the assassination of Hausa military leaders, fought against Igbo troops in the south. This led to something known as the Biafran crisis. After 2 years of instability and chaos and violence, Igbo-dominated regions decided to try and secede from Nigeria. They declared themselves to be the Republic of Biafra. And this secession movement was, for a period of time, successful. For nearly 3 years, they held off the Nigerian military, largely now coming at them from the perspective of Hausa military officers. This movement was actually supported by the initial Governor General of Nigeria, Azikiwe. Azikiwe supported this because he basically said, look, we tried a unity government, we tried independence as one nation, but the truth of the matter is that Nigeria is not one nation. Nigeria is many nations. This war, the Biafran crisis, is incredibly devastating for Nigeria. Somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million people were killed over the course of those 3 years. Now, that widespread gap between what we know about the death toll of the Biafran crisis is down to the fact that the Nigerian state was in chaos during the course of the secession movement and resulting civil war. Statistics are notoriously hard to keep when you have a state of chaos. We know that there were war crimes committed on both sides. There are absolutely horrific civilian testimonies of violence and sexualized violence that occurred during the Biafran crisis. It is a moment of trauma for the Nigerian state, and things had started off on such an optimistic level, and then to have this crisis emerge within 7 years of independence is absolutely appalling for them. This leads in a period known as the military era. After 1965, when the Igbo army officers seize control of the capital of Lagos, assassinate various military leaders as well as the prime minister and several ministers elected to the parliament, there are a series of coups and counter coups. We will not go through every military coup d'etat because it just gets too exhausting, frankly, guys. However, in 1966, there's a counter coup against the initial coup d'etat, I know, and this establishes something known as the Federal Military Government, the FMG. This initially was led by General Yakubu Gowon, who divides Nigeria up into a bunch of different federal states, and his thought was that he could, by decentralizing the government, lessen some of those ethnic tensions. He pushed for Nigeria to kind of get back on its feet economically. It had started off so well, and so he pushes for import substitution. He doesn't want Nigeria to be reliant upon goods produced in Britain, and he also wants to see Nigeria develop beyond its agricultural base. In 1960, Nigeria was essentially the breadbasket of West Africa. It was food sufficient, it was food independent, food secure, it was able to feed itself, and it had a surplus to sell to other nations. However, Gowan really pushed for the idea of developing an industrial base. So in order to do this, he increased the oil exportation. The idea was that with more money coming out of the oil industry, then you could put that into industrialization. However, Gowan was not good at controlling corruption or clientelism, and so what you see is this rise in clientelism and rent-seeking behavior. Ultimately, Gowan rules for nearly a decade, and in 1975 he's overthrown by another general, Murtala Muhammad. Now, as you might guess by the name there, Muhammad, he is Muslim, and initially Muhammad was quite popular. He cracked down on corruption. He pushed for a transition to civilian rule. However, he was assassinated very shortly after seizing control. He was then followed by, I'm going to give it a shot, Olusegun Obasanjo. I'm pretty sure I'm putting my accents in the wrong place. Please forgive me if you know better than I do. Obasanjo initially tried to push for civilian rule as well. And in 1979, he had a new constitution drafted, which replaced the old parliamentary system with a presidential system instead. What Obasanjo was trying to do here was separate out the connection between, say, control of the legislative body and control of the executive branch. Remember, in a parliamentary system, the way you get to be the head executive is by also being having the most people in a particular political party in parliament. But Obasanjo decides that he wants to separate that out. So in 1979, this new constitution is drafted. It's supposed to create sort of a unifying figure in the form of the president of Nigeria. In order to enact this constitution, Obasanjo resigns. He retires from the position of essentially military dictator, and democratic elections are held in 1979. This is going to usher in what we call the Second Nigerian Republic. After the election is held, Shehu Shagari, who is a northerner, he's Muslim, is elected as the first president of Nigeria. There hasn't been a president before this, they've all been prime ministers. However, he's got a heck of a situation on his hands. He has ethnic divisions, the economy is still in decline, largely because the oil markets in 1979 are starting to tank. We're going to talk about this a lot over the next couple of units, but 1979 for oil is terrible. And after that period, like, the oil markets are unstable and you frankly can't really rely on them very much. So Nigeria, during the course of the 1970s and 1960s, really just doubled down on its oil production, and all of a sudden the oil markets collapse. So to try and prevent unrest as the economy is tanking, the government decides to double down on social expenditures, okay? So they're trying to, increase social benefits. Shagari also was trying to pay off potential political rivals. He felt like he needed more time in office in order to be able to accomplish what he needed to do, and so he resorted to bribery, which is not good. So in 1983, there's another election. Shagari tries, because he makes the argument that he hasn't had enough time to get things done. Shagari tries to stay in power by rigging the elections. It's really blatant, it's not particularly well done, and as a result, he is overthrown by another military leader. This is Muhammadu Buhari, and if that name sounds familiar to you, that's because that is the current president of Nigeria. So Muhammadu Buhari was, in 1983, a young military officer. Today he is in his 60s or 70s, I'd have to look it up, and is president of Nigeria. So between 1983 and 1999, military rule dominated the political life of Nigerians. There were brief moments where there were attempts to establish democracies or to try to transition to it, but broadly there were two major military leaders that you need to know from this period: Ibrahim Babangida and Sani Abacha. Both of them were generals, and both of them were, in a lot of ways, deeply brutal. So Babangida initially, when he came to power after Muhammadu Buhari stepped down and handed it over to him, he inherited a situation of growing economic crisis. The oil tankers had marked, there had been massive social expenditures undertaken by the previous administration, and so he went to the IMF and to the World Bank and got loans. Now, both of those things were probably necessary, but the IMF and the World Bank both required structural adjustments as a contingent of their loans. This meant major cuts to public spending, things like infrastructure and education, social expenditure like pensions, all got cut back. This is a facet of neoliberalism. It's free market economics. The idea was to create a better and more stable society, but it did have consequences. During this period, Babangida packed the government with people from the north. He favored people from the north. That's very clear in his policies. In 1993, Babangida made a statement that he would try to have civilian elections, but when those election results came in, they were not favorable to northerners, so he had the results annulled. That did not make people happy. As a result, you had an outbreak of violence that destabilized the country and therefore was a justification for Babangida to stay in power. In 1993, Sani Abacha seized power from Babangida. And Abacha is a pretty brutal guy. He's a straight-up dictator and regularly used violence and force to try to suppress any critics of the regime. Violence and even assassination was not uncommon for opponents to the regime, and it's very, very clear that there's at least a degree of kleptocracy under the Abacha regime. If you do the math, we're looking at a deficit of about $6 billion that is missing from state coffers that probably went into Abacha's hands. I'm going to stop here. There should be just a little bit left in one final video, and then I want you to take a quick little quiz. So I'll be right back.